The wind had no kindness in it. It was a raw, ceaseless thing that scoured the plains of western Kansas, stripping the land down to its bones of rock and dust. It whipped the canvas top of the wagon into a frantic rhythm, a sound like a trapped bird beating its wings. Above, the sky was a fathomless ocean of black, punctured by the cold, distant light of 1,000,000 stars. They offered no warmth, only a reminder of how small a man and a woman were in this vast, indifferent emptiness. Eli held the reins, his knuckles chapped and white. Beside him, Clara sat as still as a stone effigy. The wedding had been a 5-minute affair in the preacher's dusty office, the only witness a fly buzzing against the window pane. Now, she was his wife, and they were heading home to his ranch under the uncaring gaze of the cosmos. The silence in the wagon was heavier than any cargo he had ever hauled. It was a living entity, pressing in on him, filling the space between them until he could hardly breathe. He glanced at her. Her face, half hidden by the shadow of her bonnet, was pale and drawn. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon, but he suspected she saw nothing of the landscape. Her gaze was turned inward, locked on a vista of memory he could not access. She wore a dress of simple gray calico, loaned to her by the preacher's wife. It hung on her slender frame, a borrowed garment for a borrowed life. It was supposed to be her wedding dress, but it looked more like mourning attire. She hadn't spoken a single word since saying, "I do." Not when he'd helped her onto the wagon, not when he'd wrapped a woolen blanket around her shoulders to ward off the biting wind, not once during the 2-hour journey. His ranch was little more than a sturdy cabin and a barn, a lonely outpost carved out of the wilderness, but he had worked for a week to make it a home for her. He had scrubbed the floorboards until they shone, replaced the oiled paper in the window with a real pane of glass he'd bought in town, and built a small bookshelf next to the hearth. The scent of fresh-cut pine and beeswax filled the small room when he pushed the door open. A fire was already crackling in the fireplace, casting a warm, dancing light across the space. "We're here, Clara," he said, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet. "Welcome home." She stepped over the threshold without looking at him, her movements slow and deliberate. She surveyed the room with that same vacant expression, her eyes gliding over the clean table set for two, the pot of beef stew simmering over the fire, the wildflowers he'd picked and placed in a jam jar on the mantel. There was no flicker of recognition, no hint of gratitude. She was a ghost in her own home. He served the stew, the silence stretching between them. He tried to fill it. "The journey wasn't too rough, I hope. That East Road is full of ruts." She picked at her food, her fork making a tiny scraping sound against the tin plate. "I plan to fix that fence by the creek tomorrow," he continued, desperate to hear a human voice, even if it was just his own. "Coyotes have been getting bold." Nothing. She just stared into her plate, a wall of sorrow built around her so high he couldn't see over it. He felt a familiar ache in his chest, the same one he'd felt standing outside the general store 2 weeks ago, when he'd first heard the whispers that followed her like a shroud. He'd been buying flour when he heard Martha, the storekeeper's wife, talking in a low hiss to another woman. "That's her," she'd said, nodding toward Clara, who was examining a bolt of cloth with a detached air. "The widow Malone. Husband just vanished into thin air 6 months back." The other woman, a newcomer, had leaned in closer. "Vanished?" "That's the official story," Martha had scoffed. "But folks around here know better. Matthew Malone was a hard man, quick with his fists, but he wouldn't just up and leave his land, not willingly." She'd lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper that still carried across the room. "They say she's the reason that man is dead." The words had coiled in Eli's gut. He'd looked at Clara then, truly looked at her for the first time. He saw not a killer, but a woman drowning in a sea of unspoken grief. He saw the faint, bruised shadow beneath her eye that her bonnet didn't quite hide, the way she flinched when the shop bell jangled too loudly. He saw a profound loneliness that mirrored his own. And in that moment, he had decided He had approached her the next day, his heart hammering against his ribs, and asked for her hand. He'd promised her a safe home, his name, and his protection. He promised he would never press her for anything she was not ready to give. She had simply nodded, her eyes full of a weariness that seemed ancient. Now, sitting across from her in his own home, the town's gossip felt like a poison seeping through the floorboards. When the meal was over, she rose without a word, took her plate to the wash basin, and rinsed it. Then she turned toward the small bedroom he had prepared for her. "The bed is made up fresh," he said quietly. "I'll be on the porch." She paused at the door, her back to him. For a moment, he thought she might speak. He held his breath, but she only gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, and then she was gone. The soft click of the door closing behind her, followed by the heavy, final sound of a bolt sliding into place. Eli let out the breath he was holding. The sound of the lock was like a slap in the face. It wasn't just a door she was closing. It was a part of herself, a part of her life he was not welcome in. He felt the sting of it, a raw hurt that a man feels when he offers his heart and is met with a locked door. He banked the fire, took his bedroll and a spare blanket, and stepped out into the cold night. He spread the roll on the rough-hewn planks of the porch, the promise he'd made to her echoing in his mind. He was a patient man. He had learned patience from the land, from waiting for the rain, from tracking a deer for days. He would wait for her, too. But as he lay there, staring up at the indifferent stars, a deep-seated curiosity gnawed at him. Who was this woman he had married? What horrors had she endured that had stolen her voice and left such a profound sadness in her eyes? He had married a stranger, a beautiful, broken woman haunted by ghosts he couldn't see. The nights fell into a pattern. He would rise before dawn, work until dusk, and eat his supper in silence. She would do her share of the chores with a quiet efficiency, tending the small garden, mending his clothes, keeping the cabin spotless. But she moved through the days like a phantom, her presence both constant and absent, and every night she would retreat to her room and slide the bolt home. Every night he would take his bedroll to the porch. His patience began to fray at the edges, worn thin by the relentless silence. The hurt curdled into a quiet frustration. He wanted to shake her, to demand she speak to him, to tell him what demons she was wrestling with. But he would look into her eyes and see not defiance, but a terror so profound it silenced his own anger. He had given his word. Then, one night, about a month after their wedding, something changed. The wind had died down, and an unnerving stillness had settled over the prairie. He was lying on his back, half asleep, when a sound drifted through the cracks in the cabin walls. At first, he thought it was the wind picking up again, a low, mournful sigh. But it wasn't the wind. It was a voice, her voice. He sat up, straining to listen. It was a song, a melody so steeped in sorrow it felt like the night itself was weeping. Her voice was thin and unsteady, cracking with an emotion she held back during the day. It was a lullaby, but a lullaby of loss, a tune meant to soothe a pain that could never be healed. It rose and fell, a fragile thread of sound in the immense silence, telling a story of heartbreak and final goodbyes. "Hush now, little one, close your eyes. The prairie moon is in the skies. Sleep now, though the wind may weep. A silent promise I will keep." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a tragedy he could not comprehend. They were sung with a tenderness that was achingly real, a love that had nowhere to go. Eli lay back down, but sleep was now impossible. The song played over and over in his head, each note a question. The silence had been broken, but what replaced it was an even more profound mystery. Why that song? The sadness in it was too specific, too personal. It wasn't the lament of a widow for her lost husband. It was something else, something deeper, a grief for a different kind of loss. And who was she singing it for, alone in her locked room in the middle of the night? The melody lingered in the air long after she had fallen silent, a haunting question that would give him no peace. He finally understood that her silence wasn't empty. It was full of words, full of memories, full of a story she was not yet able to tell. And this song, this heartbreaking lullaby, was the key. The song did not return, but its echo remained, woven into the fabric of the days that followed. Life on the prairie was a testament to relentless labor, a rhythm set by the sun and the seasons, leaving little room for introspection. Yet, for Eli, the questions Clara's lullaby had raised were a constant, low hum beneath the noise of his daily work. He herded his small band of longhorns across the vast, sun-baked plains, the dust rising in a cloud that coated his throat and stung his eyes. He mended fences, his hands working with the familiar competence of years, stretching the wire taut against the cedar posts, his mind miles away, trying to decipher the sorrow in his wife's voice. He swung his axe in the cottonwood grove by the creek, the clean bite of the blade into wood, a satisfying thud that punctuated the oppressive silence he shared with Clara. She worked beside him in spirit, if not in conversation, her hands always busy, weeding the garden, churning butter, scrubbing the floors. They were a team, moving in a silent, efficient orbit around the harsh center of their lives, yet they were as distant as the moon and the sun. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and faded orange, the howl of a wolf pack drifted in from the east, closer than usual. Eli saw Clara stiffen by the window, her hands freezing over the dough she was kneading. He grabbed his rifle from its pegs above the door. "Stay inside," he said, his voice low. "Bolt the door behind me." She gave a jerky nod, her eyes wide and dark. He spent an hour in the growing dark, firing 2 shots into the air to scatter the pack that was growing bold, their yellow eyes glinting just beyond the reach of his lantern light. When he returned, the cabin was dark, the door bolted as he'd instructed. He didn't bother trying the handle. He simply went to his bedroll on the porch. Weeks turned into a month, then another. The need for supplies finally forced him to make the long ride into town. He left at dawn, leaving Clara a carefully written note on the table explaining he'd be back by nightfall. As he rode, he rehearsed what he might say to her, a string of casual questions meant to pry open the door she kept so firmly shut. But the words felt clumsy and false in his mind. The town of Redemption was a single dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings. As Eli tied his horse to the hitching post outside the general store, he felt the familiar weight of eyes on him. He was no longer just Eli, the quiet rancher. He was the man who had married the widow Malone. Inside, the usual group of men were gathered around the pot-bellied stove. Though the weather was warming, they fell silent as he entered, their greetings polite but strained. He gave his list to the storekeeper, trying to ignore the whispers that started up as soon as his back was turned. But he couldn't ignore old Agnes Miller, a woman whose eyes had seen 80 years of prairie life and missed nothing. She sat in her usual rocking chair by the pickle barrel, her face a roadmap of wrinkles. "Heard you took yourself a wife, Eli," she said, her voice raspy like dry leaves. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, keeping his voice even. "Clara." "Malone's widow," she stated. Not asked. He heard a snicker from the men by the stove. "A quiet one. She is, always was, even when Matthew was alive." Agnes leaned forward, her gaze sharp. He was a hard man. That Matthew had a temper like a summer thunderstorm, quick to anger and quicker with his hands. Saw her in here a few times, trying to hide the marks on her face with a low bonnet. Eli's jaw tightened. He had suspected as much, but hearing it spoken aloud gave the suspicion a terrible, solid form. "Heard he just lit out," one of the men drawled. "Left her with nothing." Agnes snorted, a dry, dismissive sound. Matthew Malone loved his land more than he loved breathing. He wouldn't leave it, not unless he was forced to. She pinned Eli with her gaze again. "Last time I saw the two of them together, it was a few weeks before he disappeared. They were heading into the woods up by Shadow Creek, arguing something fierce. He was dragging her by the arm. She was crying. The old woman shook her head slowly. Next thing anyone knew, he was gone, and she was saying he'd left her, never sat right with me. Eli paid for his supplies, the weight of the town's speculation heavy on his shoulders. He loaded the sacks of flour and sugar onto his pack mule, the gossip churning in his mind. Dragging her by the arm, arguing fierce. He now saw Clara's silence not as an absence of feeling, but as a fortress built to protect what was left of her. The ride home was long. When he returned, he was looking at his wife with new eyes. He saw the way her shoulders hunched when he entered a room too quickly, as if expecting a blow. He saw the faint, silvery scar near her hairline that he hadn't noticed before. One afternoon, he was coming in from the barn, and she was at the clothesline, her back to him. He reached out to let her know he was there. A simple touch on the shoulder. She screamed. It was not a loud sound, but a choked, terrified gasp as she spun around, stumbling backward, her hands flying up to shield her face. Her eyes were wide with a primal fear that had nothing to do with him. In that instant, he wasn't her husband. He was just a man, a shadow, a threat. "Clara," he said gently, holding his hands up to show he meant no harm. "It's just me. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to startle you." The terror receded from her eyes, replaced by a deep, shuddering shame. She lowered her hands, turning away from him without a word, and fled into the cabin. The sound of the bolt sliding home followed a moment later, even in the broad daylight. That night, the sky turned a strange, bruised yellow. The air grew heavy and still. A storm was coming. It broke just after dark, a furious onslaught of wind and rain that lashed the small cabin. Thunder rattled the glass in the window, and lightning bleached the landscape in stark, momentary flashes. Eli sat by the fire, listening to the storm and to the silence from the bedroom. Around midnight, a sound cut through the roar of the wind, a low moan. He got up and went to her door, pressing his ear against the rough wood. He could hear her tossing in bed, hear the ragged sound of her breathing. He knocked softly. "Clara, are you all right?" There was no answer, only another pained whimper. He tried the handle, locked. "Clara, I'm coming in," he said, his voice firm. He put his shoulder to the door, once, twice, and on the third try, the wood around the bolt splintered and the door swung inward. She was thrashing in the bed, drenched in sweat, her cheeks flushed with fever. Her skin was burning to the touch. The storm had brought with it a sickness. For the next 3 days, the world shrank to the confines of that small room. Eli did not leave her side. He bathed her forehead with cool cloths, coaxed spoonfuls of water and thin broth between her cracked lips, and held her hand when the shivers took her. The fortress of her silence crumbled under the delirium of the fever. She mumbled and cried out, her words a tangled thicket of fear and sorrow he could not penetrate. And then, in the deepest hour of the third night, as the storm outside finally exhausted itself, she spoke a name, her voice a clear, heartbreaking whisper in the quiet room. "Ruth, oh, my sweet Ruth." The name hung in the air. Ruth. It was a child's name. The lullaby. "Hush now, little one, close your eyes." It all clicked into place with the force of a physical blow. The song wasn't for a husband. It was for a child named Ruth. A cold dread, heavier than any he had ever known, settled in Eli's heart. He suspected there was a child in this story, a missing piece to the puzzle of her grief, but he had never dared to imagine it. Now he had a name, and the name made the tragedy unbearable. The fever broke the next morning. Clara woke, weak and pale, but lucid. Her eyes, clear for the first time in days, met his. He saw confusion, then fear, then a dawning awareness as she looked at the broken door. He simply nodded. "You were sick," he said. "The fever was high." She looked away, a flush of shame coloring her cheeks. He brought her a bowl of thin porridge, and she ate it slowly, without speaking. The silence was back. But it was different now. It was less a wall and more of a fragile truce. Later that afternoon, she was strong enough to sit up. Eli helped her out of the bed and wrapped her in a thick quilt, for the first time since their wedding night. She did not retreat to the bedroom. Instead, she walked on unsteady legs to the front door and sat in the rocking chair on the porch. Staring out at the rain-washed prairie, the air was clean and cool, smelling of wet earth and sage. Eli watched her from the doorway, not wanting to intrude. After a long while, she turned her head toward him. Her expression was unreadable. She reached into a small pouch that lay in her lap and pulled out a small, leather-bound book, its cover worn smooth with time. She held it out to him. He walked over and took it from her. Her fingers were cold. He looked down at the book. It was a journal. He met her eyes, a questioning look on his face. She said nothing, her gaze unwavering, but in their depths, he saw a silent plea. "Understand me." He opened the cover. On the first page, there was no writing. There was only a hand-drawn musical staff with a series of notes painstakingly inked in a delicate, sloping hand. It was the melody to a lullaby, the song she had sung alone in the middle of the night. Eli sat on the porch steps, the worn leather journal heavy in his hands. The sun was bleeding across the horizon, painting the clouds in hues of gold and rose. A beautiful end to a day that felt like it had been stripped of all color. Clara was inside, resting. He could hear the faint, rhythmic creak of the floorboards as she moved about the cabin. She had given him her past, a silent offering, and now she was waiting for his verdict. He opened the book. The pages were brittle. The ink faded in places to a watery brown. The handwriting was a graceful, slanted script that grew more jagged and desperate as the pages turned. Some pages were splotched and warped. The ink blurred into illegibility, and he knew, with a certainty that ached in his bones, that he was looking at the ghost of tears. He began to read. At first, the entries were timidly hopeful. October 12th, 1888. Matthew brought me to the ranch today. It is a hard piece of land, but he says we will make it ours. He has strong hands. When he is in a good mood, his smile can light up the entire prairie. I pray for more good moods. But the hope was a flickering candle flame, quickly extinguished. The entries grew shorter, more furtive. The good moods became scarce. November 4th, 1888. He was angry about the cost of salt in town. He said I am careless with his money. The door is bolted tonight. He says it is for my own protection, to keep the wolves out. But sometimes, the wolves are already inside. Eli felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He read of Clara's growing isolation, of weeks turning into months where she saw no one but Matthew. He read of his sudden rages, his suffocating jealousy, of the way his shadow falling across the floor could make her heart stop. The journal didn't detail the violence in graphic terms. It didn't have to. The terror was in the spaces between the words, in the descriptions of long nights spent huddled in a corner, of meals eaten in stony silence, of the careful way she learned to move and speak to avoid waking the monster. Then, a new name appeared, and the tone of the journal shifted entirely, a flicker of light in the oppressive darkness. May 3rd, 1889. I am with child, I told Matthew, and he was quiet for a long time. Then he touched my belly, just for a second. He did not smile, but he did not yell. Tonight, I feel something other than fear. I feel a secret joy. This child will be mine, a piece of me that he cannot control. Eli turned the page, his heart aching. The next year of entries was filled with Ruth, her first kick, the sound of her cry when she was born, the soft down of her hair, the way she would grasp Clara's finger with her tiny, perfect hand. For Clara, Ruth was not just a daughter. She was a reason to live, a shield against the darkness. She wrote down the words to the lullaby, the one Eli had heard her sing, A silent promise I will keep. He finally understood. The promise was to her daughter. The final entries were a descent into hell. He had to force himself to read them, his hands trembling. February 19th, 1891. Ruth is burning. The fever came on so fast. Her skin is fire, and she cries a weak kitten sound that is breaking my soul. I begged Matthew to ride for the doctor. He laughed. He said God would decide. He says fevers are a test of faith. He has locked the door. He is sitting outside it, drinking. I can hear him humming. Oh, God, my baby is dying, and he is humming. February 20th, 1891. She is gone. My light is gone. She grew so still in my arms this morning, just as the sun was rising. Her little chest stopped moving. I have been holding her all day. She is growing cold. The world is silent. There is no God here. Eli had to close the book. His vision blurred. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes, but he couldn't block out the image of Clara, alone in a locked room, holding her dead child. He took a ragged breath and forced himself to open it again. There were only a few pages left. February 21st, 1891. He finally unbolted the door. He looked at Ruth in my arms and just shrugged. He told me to bury her out back, like an animal. I will not. Tonight, when he is passed out from drink, I will take her somewhere beautiful, somewhere he can never touch. February 22nd, 1891. I buried my daughter by moonlight, under the old oak tree by Shadow Creek. I wrapped her in my only good shawl and sang her our song one last time. When I came back, I told him she had been taken, snatched by Indians, maybe, or a wolf. It was a stupid lie, but it was all I had. He didn't believe me. I saw the rage in his eyes, a fire that wanted to burn the world down. The writing stopped. The rest of the page was a smear of ink, as if the journal had been knocked from her hands. The final entry was on the next page, written in a shaky, barely legible scrawl. February 23rd, 1891. I woke up on the floor. My head aches. There is blood on my dress. The cabin is empty. He is gone. The door is wide open, and the wind is blowing through. I am alone. He is gone. Eli closed the book. The story ended there. But he knew, with a chilling certainty, what had happened in the space between those last two entries. Matthew had flown into a rage, and Clara, a grieving mother with nothing left to lose, had fought back. She had pushed him, a desperate act of self-preservation, and he had fallen. She had accidentally killed the man who had tormented her, the man who had let her daughter die. The town's gossip was a cruel, twisted version of the truth. She's the reason that man is dead. Yes, she was, but they would never understand how. He sat there for a long time, the setting sun casting a long shadow from his body. He felt no anger, no judgment. All he felt was a profound, bottomless wave of sorrow for the woman inside his house. He finally understood her silence, her fear of his touch, her locked door. They were the scars of a war no one else had seen. He stood up and went inside. The cabin was dim, lit only by a single lantern on the table. Clara was standing by the cold hearth, her arms wrapped around herself. She looked small and fragile, like a bird with a broken wing. She watched him approach, her eyes searching his face for the verdict, for condemnation, for disgust. Her voice, when it came, was a raw, broken whisper, the first words she had truly spoken to him. "I am not the woman you should have married." It was a confession, an apology, and a warning, all in one. She was offering him an escape. He could leave now, and no one would blame him. He had married a woman who had killed her husband. Eli stopped a few feet from her. He looked at her, at the haunted sorrow in her eyes, at the trembling of her hands. He didn't say a word. He didn't offer empty comforts or false reassurances. The horror she had endured was beyond the reach of words. Instead, He simply walked to the chair by the table, pulled it out, and sat down. He kept his hands on his knees and his gaze steady, and he just stayed. He sat with her in the heavy silence, letting his presence be his answer. I am not leaving. I am not afraid. I am here. They sat like that for what felt like hours. The silence in the room no longer a wall between them, but a shared space of understanding. The last of the light faded from the sky, and the cabin was enveloped in darkness, save for the small pool of light from the lantern. Finally, Eli rose. His muscles were stiff. You must be hungry, he said quietly. He moved to the stove, his movements slow and deliberate. He found the leftover stew from the night before and began to heat it up. He sliced a piece of bread, ladled the stew into 2 bowls, and set them on the table. He did it all without looking at her, giving her space. He slid one of the bowls across the table toward her empty chair. As he did, his hand brushed against hers, which was resting on the tabletop. Her whole body went rigid. A tremor ran through her hand, a violent, uncontrollable shaking born of memory and fear. He felt the instinct to pull back, to apologize, to erase the contact, but he stopped himself. He gently closed his own larger, calloused hand over hers, stilling the trembling. Her hand was as cold as ice. She tensed, ready to bolt, but he didn't move, didn't tighten his grip. He just held her hand. A simple, warm weight. He felt the frantic terror in her pulse begin to slow. He watched as she took a shallow breath, then another. Her hand was still trembling, but she did not pull away. The hand-holding in the kitchen was not a beginning, but the cracking of a seal. In the days that followed, the suffocating silence that had defined their marriage did not vanish, but it thinned, becoming a shared quiet rather than a separating wall. She still did not speak much, but her presence changed. She began to meet his eyes across the dinner table. When he came in from the fields, tired and caked with dust, she would have a basin of warm water waiting for him. These were small gestures, tiny shoots of trust growing in the barren soil of her past. And to Eli, they felt like a miracle. He never mentioned the journal again. He put it away in his own small chest of belongings, treating it as the sacred, painful relic it was. He understood that her story was not a thing to be discussed, but a truth to be respected. His role was not to fix her, but to stand beside her, a steady presence against the ghosts that haunted her. He took to sleeping on the porch not as a rejection, but as a routine, a quiet affirmation of his promise. They had found a fragile peace, a rhythm that worked for them. Then, one hot afternoon, a rider appeared on the horizon. Eli saw him first, a dark speck shimmering in the heat haze. Strangers were rare, and rarely a good sign. He stopped his work mending a harness and watched, his hand resting near the axe handle on the chopping block. As the rider drew closer, Eli saw he was well dressed for this part of the country. In a dark coat and a clean hat, he rode a fine black mare, not a working ranch horse. This was a man of means, and a man with a purpose. Clara came to the cabin door, a dishcloth in her hand. Eli saw her follow his gaze, saw the moment her body went rigid, as if turned to stone. All the softness that had begun to return to her face vanished, replaced by the old, familiar mask of terror. She took a step back into the shadows of the doorway, becoming a ghost once more. The rider stopped a few yards from the porch, dismounting with a fluid grace. He was handsome in a sharp, predatory way, with dark, watchful eyes and a smile that didn't reach them. He took off his hat, revealing a slick of dark hair. "Quite a piece of land you've got here," the man said, his voice smooth and educated. It was a voice that didn't belong to the dust and wind. He glanced past Eli, his eyes fixing on the doorway where Clara was barely visible. "I'm looking for a man, my brother, Matthew Malone." Eli felt a cold dread wash over him. He stepped forward slightly, consciously placing his body between the stranger and the cabin door. "Malone's not here," Eli said, his voice flat. The man's smile widened, but it held no warmth. "So I've heard. My name is Silas Malone. And you must be Eli." He let his gaze drift back to the doorway. "The folks in town have all sorts of stories. They say my brother's widow didn't wait long to replace him. Now she's your wife." The words were spoken politely, but they were laced with poison. Each one was a calculated jab, meant to wound and provoke. Eli could feel Clara shrink further into the shadows behind him. "My wife's name is Clara," Eli said, his voice hard as iron. "And what happens on my land is my business." Silas chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. "Oh, I think it's my business, too. See, Matthew was my older brother. I always looked out for him, and I find it very strange that a man who loved his property more than life itself would just up and vanish, leaving everything behind, especially his pretty young wife." He took a step closer, his dark eyes boring into Eli's. Eli stood his ground, unmoving. He could smell the faint scent of bay rum and malice on the man. Silas had loved Clara. Eli remembered the whispers, not with a wholesome affection, but with the possessive jealousy of a man who covets what his brother has. "She doesn't want to see you, Silas," Eli said. "Doesn't she?" Silas's eyes flickered to the doorway again. "Clara, is that true? Not even a word for your brother-in-law, who rode all this way out of concern for you?" A choked, whimpering sound came from inside the cabin. It was the sound of a terrified animal. Eli's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You've said your piece. It's time for you to leave." Silas held his hands up in mock surrender. All right. I see the lady of the house is indisposed." He changed tactics, his voice shifting to one of reasonable business. "Perhaps you and I can talk, then man to man. This is a lot of land for one person to handle, and it's tainted property, you might say, full of bad memories. I'd be willing to take it off your hands. For a fair price, of course. You and your wife could pack up, head west, start fresh somewhere, no one knows your names." It was a threat wrapped in a transaction. "Leave, or I will make your life here impossible." Eli knew what Silas was doing. He wasn't just after the land. He was trying to isolate Clara, to strip her of the only protection she had ever known. "The land's not for sale," Eli said, "and we're not going anywhere." Silas's smile finally faded, replaced by a cold, hard glare. "That's a mistake, friend. My brother had a knack for getting what he wanted. It runs in the family." He put his hat back on, tugging the brim low. "I'll be in town for a while, in case you change your mind." He swung himself onto his horse, gave one last, lingering look at the cabin door, and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and a suffocating sense of menace in his wake. Eli stood there until Silas was just a speck on the horizon again. He let out a long, slow breath, his body still humming with tension. When he turned, Clara was gone. The cabin door was closed, and he knew, without trying it, that it was bolted. The fragile peace had been shattered. He didn't see her for the rest of the day. He worked until his muscles screamed in protest, chopping firewood with a savage intensity, trying to sweat out the poison Silas had left behind. He ate his dinner alone, the silence in the cabin once again heavy and oppressive. He took his bedroll to the porch as usual, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. He had failed. He had let the outside world in, and it had sent her retreating back into her prison of fear. But the next morning, something was different. When he came in from checking the livestock, there was a pot of coffee brewing on the stove, filling the cabin with a rich, comforting aroma. A plate with 2 biscuits and a slice of bacon was on the table. She was nowhere to be seen, but the offering was unmistakable. Later that day, he found his work shirts, which had been in a pile for mending, neatly folded on his bed, the tiers stitched with small, careful stitches. In the evening, She sat at the table with him, and though she was silent, she didn't flee when the meal was done. She stayed, her hands clasped in her lap, watching the fire. She was fighting. For the first time, instead of just surrendering to the fear, she was pushing back against it. Silas's arrival had terrified her, but Eli's steadfast presence had given her an anchor she'd never had before. She was not just surviving anymore. She was choosing to stay. A week passed in this new, delicate balance. One evening, they sat by the fire, the flames casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The wind howled outside, a lonely counterpoint to the warmth inside. Eli was cleaning his rifle, the familiar clicks of the metal parts a soothing sound in the quiet. He felt her eyes on him, and when he looked up, she was watching him with an intensity that made his breath catch. She finally spoke, her voice low and laced with a vulnerability that pierced him to the core. "If you know everything, all of it, do you still want to live with me?" The question was a trembling. It held all her fears, all her shame, all her desperate hope. It was the ultimate test. Eli carefully set down the rifle parts. He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as a widow, not as a victim, but as the woman he was coming to love with a fierce, protective tenderness. He rose from his chair and walked over to her, kneeling on one knee before her so they were at eye level. She flinched as he reached out, but he was slow, telegraphing his every move. He gently placed his hand on her cheek. Her skin was soft, and a tear was tracing a path down it. He wiped it away with his thumb. "Clara," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "I want to be here every night." He paused, his gaze holding hers. "But only when you let me in." Her breath hitched, a soft, broken sob. The dam of her restraint finally broke. She leaned forward, collapsing against him, her arms wrapping around his neck, holding on as if he were the only solid thing in a world that was trying to sweep her away. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her tightly, feeling the frailness of her body, the violent shuddering of her sobs. It was the first time they had ever touched like this, the first time they had ever held each other. He held her until the sobs subsided into quiet, ragged breaths. She pulled back slightly, her face tear-streaked and luminous in the firelight. He saw a universe of pain in her eyes, but for the first time, he also saw a flicker of a different kind of fire, a longing to live, a yearning to be loved. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. She didn't. She closed her eyes and met him halfway. Their lips met in a kiss that was anything but gentle. It was clumsy and desperate and salty with her tears. It was a kiss of shared sorrow and a ferocious, unquenchable thirst for life. It was a kiss that tasted of pain and promises, a trembling, passionate collision of two broken souls who had finally, in the heart of the vast, lonely wilderness, found their way home. That first kiss was not an end to the pain, but a promise that it no longer had to be borne alone. The bolt on Clara's bedroom door was never slid home again, and while Eli still gave her the space of her own bed, the cabin itself no longer felt like two separate territories. It became a shared home, warmed by a fragile but growing intimacy. The nights became their sanctuary. After the hard labor of the day was done, they would sit by the fire, the vast, silent prairie pressing in on the small circle of their light, and Clara began to talk. She spoke of Ruth. She unspooled her memories like a precious thread, one detail at a time. At first, it was just a whisper, a hesitant offering. But Eli's patient silence was a vessel she could finally pour her grief into, and the stories started to flow. She told him of Ruth's laugh, a sound like tiny bells. She described the fierce, determined way her daughter had learned to pull herself up, her small hands gripping the edge of a wooden crate. She spoke of the dandelion fluff Ruth would chase in the spring, her little legs pumping, her face alight with pure joy. And she told him about the songs. "I sang to her every night," she murmured, her gaze lost in the dancing flames. Even in the womb, I wanted her to know my voice before she ever saw my face. The lullaby, the one you heard, it was hers. I wrote it for her, a promise that I would always keep her safe. Her voice broke on the last word, and a tear slipped down her cheek. Eli didn't speak. He simply reached out and took her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it. A silent message that he was there, listening. He learned that her grief was not a single, monolithic thing, but a landscape of 1,000 tiny, sharp-edged memories. The way Ruth's head smelled after a bath, the dimple that appeared in her left cheek when she smiled, the weight of her small, sleeping body in her arms. Each memory was a treasure and a torment, and in sharing them with Eli, the burden seemed to fraction, to become lighter. One Saturday, Eli rode into town alone. He returned late in the afternoon with his usual supplies, and one other item, wrapped carefully in a burlap sack. He found Clara on the porch, watching the sunset. He wordlessly handed her the package. She looked at him, confused, then took the bundle. It was heavier than she expected. She untied the twine and pulled back the rough cloth. Inside was a small parlor guitar. It was old, the dark wood scarred and scuffed from a long life. But the strings were new, and it had been polished to a soft gleam. Clara stared at it, her hands hovering over the instrument as if afraid to touch it. She traced the curve of its body with one finger, her expression unreadable. Eli saw her throat work as she swallowed hard. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. A choked, grateful sound was all she could manage. "A voice like yours shouldn't stay silent," he said softly. That night, she held the guitar, her fingers finding the chords with a rusty, long-forgotten familiarity. She didn't sing, not yet, but she played the melody of Ruth's lullaby, the notes filling the small cabin with a beauty that was profoundly sad and yet, for the first time, hopeful. The music, the stories, the shared glances, they were all threads weaving them closer together, creating a bond that went deeper than words. The physical space between them began to shrink, a lingering touch as they passed in the narrow kitchen. His hand on the small of her back as he guided her through the doorway. Small, incidental contacts that sent a jolt of awareness through them both. The desire was there, a low, simmering heat beneath the surface of their quiet lives, but it was tempered by his patience and her fear. The night it finally happened was unplanned, unexpected. A summer storm had rolled in, the same kind that had brought on her fever months before. But this time, there was no fear. They stood on the porch together, watching the lightning fork across the distant sky, feeling the cool rush of wind that came before the rain. When the downpour started, they retreated not to separate corners, but to the barn to check on the animals. The air inside was warm and thick with the smell of hay, animals, and rain-soaked earth. The drumming of the rain on the tin roof was a loud, hypnotic rhythm. They worked together in the lantern light, their movements easy and synchronized. When the last of the animals was settled, they stood in the main aisle, the storm roaring outside, cocooning them in their own private world. Eli looked at her. Her hair had come loose from its pins, and damp tendrils clung to her face. Her eyes, illuminated by the golden lantern light, were dark and deep. The air between them grew thick, charged with unspoken longing. He raised a hand and gently brushed a stray piece of hair from her cheek. His fingers lingered on her skin. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut. It was all the invitation he needed. He lowered his head and kissed her, and this time there was no desperation, only a deep, soulful tenderness. It was a kiss that spoke of everything they had shared, the grief, the fear, the quiet hope. When they broke apart, they were both breathless. "Clara," he whispered, his voice hoarse. She didn't answer with words. She simply took his hand and led him toward an empty stall at the back of the barn, one filled with clean, Soft hay, in the dim, flickering light, surrounded by the wild symphony of the storm. They came together. It was both fierce and gentle, a frantic, desperate claiming and a slow, tender discovery. For Eli, it was an act of pure love. For Clara, it was something more. It was a reclamation, in the safety of his arms, amidst the scent of hay and old leather. She was not an object of a man's rage, but a willing partner in an act of profound intimacy. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the hay, their bodies slick with sweat, the rain softening to a gentle patter on the roof. Clara lay with her head on his chest, her fingers tracing idle patterns over his skin. The silence that fell was not empty, but full and peaceful. "No one has ever touched me like you," she whispered into the darkness, her voice so quiet he could barely hear it over the rain. It's not the act itself. With Matthew, I always felt unclean, marked." She took a shaky breath. "But you make me feel like I am not dirty anymore. You make me feel whole." He tightened his arms around her, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. His heart so full he thought it might burst. He had no words that could possibly answer that. He just held her, hoping she could feel the depth of his love in his embrace. They stayed that way for a long time, drifting in a peaceful daze. The world was just the two of them, the smell of the rain and the warmth of their bodies. The peace felt so complete, so perfect, that it seemed nothing could ever shatter it. Which is why, when the barn door scraped open, the sound was like a gunshot. They both froze. Eli sat up, pulling Clara behind him, shielding her body with his own as he reached for the pitchfork that was leaning against the stall wall. A figure stood silhouetted against the gray, post-storm light of the doorway. A familiar, dreaded figure. "Well, isn't this cozy?" Silas Malone's smooth voice dripped with venomous satisfaction. He held up the lantern he was carrying, the light illuminating his smug, hateful smile. His eyes raked over them, taking in their state of undress, the tangled hay. "It seems I've interrupted the happy couple."
"Get out, Silas!"
Eli growled, his voice a low threat. He stood up slowly, keeping himself between Silas and Clara. "Oh, I'll leave," Silas said with a laugh. "But not alone. I've been a busy man. Eli, asking questions, poking around. You know, my brother was a creature of habit. He had a favorite spot up by Shadow Creek, a little ravine where he liked to sit and drink." Eli's blood ran cold. He felt Clara begin to tremble violently behind him. Silas reached into a saddlebag he was carrying and pulled something out. He let it dangle from his fingers. Even in the dim light, they could see what it was. The tattered, mud-caked remains of a man's shirt, with a large, dark stain across the chest. "I found this snagged on a root at the bottom of the ravine," Silas said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Recognize it, Clara? It was his favorite blue shirt, the one he was wearing the day he disappeared." He took a step into the barn, his smile widening as he saw the pure terror on Clara's face. "I have a choice for you, my dear sister-in-law," he said, his voice turning hard and cruel. "You can pack your things and ride away with me, right now. We'll start a new life. Just you and me, or you can stay here, and I will take this shirt to the sheriff in Redemption, and I will tell him exactly where I found it, and I will tell him all about how my brother's timid little wife was the last person to see him alive." He let the threat hang in the air, a final, devastating blow. "Come with me, Clara, or I will hand you over to the law." Clara let out a strangled cry, a sound of pure panic. She scrambled to her feet, pulling on her dress with shaking hands. "Eli, no!" she pleaded, grabbing his arm, her eyes wild with fear. "Don't do anything foolish. Please. I've already destroyed one person's life. I won't let you be next." Silas's threat hung in the air of the small cabin, a poison that seeped into the fragile peace they had built. Clara was consumed by a frantic terror, convinced that Eli's protection of her would lead to his ruin. "You have to let me go," she pleaded that night, her voice ragged with panic. "He'll destroy you. I can't be the reason for that." "No," Eli said, his voice a low, steady anchor in her storm of fear. He took her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his gaze. "We don't run. We fight. He's counting on your fear. It's the only weapon he has." The next morning, before the sun had risen, Eli saddled his horse. He kissed Clara, a firm, promising kiss. "Bolt the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone. I'll be back." He rode not west, away from the threat, but east, toward the town of redemption. He needed more than just resolve. He needed a weapon of his own, and the only weapon that could defeat a lie was the truth. His destination was a small, dusty office with the words, "Silas Abernathy, attorney at law," painted on the window. Abernathy was an old man with watery eyes and a reputation for being quietly astute. He had handled Matthew Malone's land deeds years ago. Eli laid out the situation, omitting the most brutal details of Clara's journal but making it clear that Silas's reappearance was a threat, not a gesture of familial concern. "I need to know about the official report on Matthew's disappearance," Eli said. "What did the sheriff do?" Abernathy leaned back in his creaky chair, steepling his long, thin fingers. "Not much," he said after a long silence. "That's what was always so peculiar about it. Sheriff Brody, the man in charge back then, was notoriously lazy. But this was different. Matthew Malone was a landowner. A man like that vanishes. You expect a proper search. But Brody just asked a few questions, accepted the widow's story that he'd run off, and closed the file in less than a week." The lawyer peered at Eli over his spectacles. It was common knowledge that Matthew was a brute. More than a few folks saw his wife with bruises she tried to hide. "My guess? Sheriff Brody didn't want to look too hard. Finding a body would mean a lot of troublesome paperwork, maybe even a trial. It was easier for everyone to believe he'd just ridden away." Abernathy sighed. "It was an open secret. Eli, a story that was allowed to be forgotten because the truth would have been inconvenient." The words confirmed Eli's suspicions. The foundation of Silas's threat was built on a lie, propped up by a town's willful ignorance. But it wasn't enough. He needed proof. He needed to find what Silas only pretended to have. "Thank you, Mr. Abernathy," Eli said, standing up. He knew what he had to do. He didn't ride straight back to the ranch. He turned his horse north, toward the cottonwoods that lined Shadow Creek. He found the ravine Silas had spoken of easily. It was a deep, jagged scar in the earth, choked with thorny brush and loose rock. Leaving his horse tied to a tree, he began the grim descent. The air at the bottom was cool and damp, smelling of decay. He found the deep-rooted tree Silas had mentioned and began to dig, his shovel scraping against rocks and roots. It was back-breaking work under the hot sun. He dug for hours, his hands blistering, his shirt soaked with sweat, driven by a desperate, prayerful urgency. Just as he was about to give up, his shovel struck something with a dull, hollow thud. He dropped to his knees, clawing at the dirt with his bare hands. He unearthed a rib cage first, then the long bones of a leg. It was a human skeleton, tumbled and broken by the fall. He kept digging, his heart pounding, until his fingers brushed against something hard and smooth. He pulled it free from the dirt. It was a heavy leather belt, the buckle tarnished but unmistakable. Engraved in the silver were two initials, M.M. He had found Matthew Malone. While Eli was unearthing the dead, Silas Malone was growing impatient. He had given them his ultimatum, and the waiting was gnawing at him. He was convinced Eli would try something, and he decided he couldn't risk it. He would take what he wanted, now. He rode to the ranch, his black mare eating up the miles. He found the cabin door bolted. As he expected, he didn't bother knocking. He went to the side of the cabin, used the butt of his pistol to smash the single glass window pane, and climbed inside. Clara screamed, scrambling back from the hearth where she'd been stoking the fire. "Get away from me!" "We're leaving, Clara," Silas said, his voice dangerously calm as he advanced on her. "I'm tired of waiting. You and I are going to start our new life." "No," she cried, grabbing a cast-iron skillet. "I'm not going anywhere with you." He laughed and lunged, easily knocking the skillet from her hand. He was stronger than her, and he grabbed her wrists, twisting them behind her back. She fought, kicking and struggling, a wildcat fury in her eyes he had never seen before. But he was relentless. He dragged her out of the cabin and toward his buggy, a light carriage he had waiting. He forced her onto the seat, quickly tying her wrists to the iron railing with a leather thong. "You'll learn to be obedient," he snarled. Climbing up beside her and grabbing the reins, he cracked the whip, and the horses lurched forward, pulling the buggy away from the ranch at a fast clip. But the woman beside him was not the same terrified girl he had once known. She had tasted freedom. She had known kindness. She had felt love. As Silas focused on steering the spooked horses, Clara lunged forward, her teeth sinking into the hand that held the reins. She bit down with the force of a cornered animal, a surge of pure, desperate adrenaline giving her strength. She felt cartilage and bone give way. Silas roared in agony, a sound of pure shock and rage. His hand flew from the reins, blood pouring from the mangled ruin of his finger. The horses, without guidance, broke into a panicked gallop. In that one moment of chaos, Clara threw her body sideways, tumbling out of the speeding buggy. She hit the hard-packed earth, the impact knocking the wind from her. But she scrambled to her feet, ignoring the searing pain in her shoulder, and ran. She ran across the open prairie, her lungs burning, her only thought to get away. Behind her, she could hear Silas screaming curses, regaining control of the horses, and the sound of the wheels beginning to turn in pursuit. It was then that Eli, riding hard from Shadow Creek with his grim discovery wrapped in a saddlebag, crested a small rise. He saw the scene below him and his blood ran cold. The buggy careening across the plain, and the small, lone figure of his wife running for her life. He dug his heels into his horse's flanks, the animal leaping forward into a desperate, life-or-death gallop. He intercepted them in a cloud of dust, cutting off the buggy's path and forcing Silas to haul back on the reins. Before the carriage had even stopped, Eli was off his horse, launching himself at Silas and dragging him down to the ground. They rolled in the dirt, a whirlwind of fists and fury. Eli was driven by a righteous rage, but Silas was heavier and fueled by a pain-maddened frenzy. Silas managed to throw Eli off and scrambled for the pistol tucked in his belt. He brought it up just as Eli charged him again. Clara screamed. The gunshot exploded in the prairie silence. A white-hot pain tore through Eli's left arm, and he staggered back, clutching the wound, his strength failing him. Silas stood over him, his face a mask of triumph and hate, the gun aimed at Eli's chest. "It's over," he spat. But as he looked up, he froze. Clara was standing 10 feet away. She was holding Eli's rifle, which had fallen from his saddle scabbard. She held it with a strange, terrifying stillness, the barrel aimed directly at Silas's heart. Her hands were steady. Her face was pale, but set with a grim resolve. For one horrifying second, she was not Clara, the gentle wife. She was a woman pushed past her limit, an avenging angel born of suffering. "Go on," Silas sneered, a nervous tremor in his voice. "Fulfill your reputation. Be the killer everyone in town whispers you are." A flicker of agony crossed Clara's face. She looked from Silas's hateful sneer to Eli, bleeding in the dust, and for a moment, her finger tightened on the trigger. Then, a shudder ran through her body. Her shoulders slumped, not in defeat, but in a profound, soul-deep decision. She lowered the rifle barrel toward the ground. "I already chose not to be a killer once before," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "I won't become one now." Just as the words left her lips, the sound of hoofbeats reached them. Over the rise, 2 riders appeared, moving at a gallop. It was the new sheriff from Redemption, A man named Miller, with his deputy beside him, Mr. Abernathy, his conscience pricked by Eli's visit, had gone straight to the law and insisted they ride out to the ranch. They arrived to a scene of chaos. Eli wounded, Silas holding a pistol, and Clara with a rifle in her hands. "Drop the weapon, Malone," the sheriff yelled, his own gun drawn. Silas, seeing he was trapped, threw his pistol down in disgust. As the deputy cuffed him, Eli, weak but resolute, gestured to his saddlebag. The sheriff opened it and stared down at the human skull and the tarnished belt buckle inside. The truth, buried for so long under a shroud of lies and fear, had finally been brought into the light. The truth, once unearthed, sent a tremor through the quiet, dusty life of redemption. Silas Malone was held in the town jail, his venomous lies silenced by the stark reality of his brother's bones and the weight of his own violent actions. The story of what had truly happened in that lonely cabin 2 years ago spread not like wildfire, but like slow seeping water, finding its way into every home and every conversation. The town did not apologize. Towns like Redemption never did. There were no grand gestures of contrition, no delegations of townsfolk riding out to the ranch to beg forgiveness. But the change was palpable all the same. It was in the small, almost imperceptible shifts in attitude. When Eli and Clara rode into town a few weeks later for supplies, his arm in a clean sling, the whispers that followed them were different. The malice was gone, replaced by a hushed, awkward curiosity that was tinged with something like shame. Martha, the storekeeper's wife, who had once sneered at Clara's presence, now busied herself arranging a stack of canned peaches, unable to meet Clara's eye. When she handed over their supplies, she mumbled, "Hope you're finding things to your liking now, ma'am." It was a clumsy, inadequate peace offering, but it was a beginning. Men on the street who used to stare through her now touched the brim of their hats as she passed. A few of the women, the same ones who had traded the most vicious gossip, offered hesitant, tight-lipped nods of greeting. They were acknowledgments, not of friendship, but of a shared, uncomfortable truth. They had judged a woman for her silence, never imagining the horrors that had imposed it. For Clara, who had known only scorn and suspicion for so long, these small gestures of civility felt like a cool drink of water after years in a desert. But the true healing began not in the town, but on their own land, on a high, windy hill that overlooked the vast expanse of the prairie. It was the place where Clara had told him she had buried her daughter. Eli spent a week working there. He cleared the wild grass and stones from the small, unmarked patch of earth. He rode miles to find the right piece of flat, sturdy sandstone. With a hammer and an old chisel, he spent hours carefully, painstakingly carving into the stone. He was not a stonemason, and the work was slow and imperfect, but it was done with a loving reverence that was a prayer in itself. When he was finished, a small, respectable headstone stood on the hill. On it, he had carved a single name, Ruth. Beneath the name, he had done his best to etch the simple, graceful notes of the lullaby, copying them directly from the first page of Clara's journal. He showed it to her one evening as the sun was setting. She walked to the top of the hill, her hand in his, and when she saw it, she stopped. She stared at the name, her daughter's name, finally given a place of honor under the open sky. She traced the carved letters with her fingertips, then the notes of the song. She didn't cry. Her face held a look of such profound, solemn gratitude that it moved Eli more than tears ever could. She simply leaned her head against his shoulder, and they stood together, watching the last of the light fade from the world. A few nights later, under the light of a full, silver moon, Clara went to the hill alone. She carried her old guitar, its wood gleaming softly in the moonlight. Eli watched her go from the porch, understanding that this was a pilgrimage she had to make by herself. He waited, giving her time, but after an hour, a sound drifted down from the hill, a sound so pure and beautiful it made the stars seem to weep. It was her voice, clear and strong, rising into the vast, empty night. She was singing. He walked quietly toward the hill, staying in the shadows of a lone cottonwood tree at its base. He sat down, leaning against the rough bark, and listened. She sang Ruth's lullaby first, her voice full of a tender, heartbreaking love. It was no longer the broken, desperate whisper he had first heard through the cabin walls. It was a proper farewell, a mother's final, loving tribute to her child. Then she began to sing other songs, old hymns and quiet folk ballads he hadn't heard in years. Her voice soared over the prairie, a single thread of warmth and life in the immense, cool darkness. The wind moved through the tall grass on the hill, making a soft, sighing sound, like the gentle breath of a sleeping child. Listening to her, Eli felt the last of his own anger and resentment toward Matthew, toward Silas, toward the town, simply wash away, leaving only a deep, aching empathy for the woman on the hill. He felt tears tracking down his own cheeks, hot against his cool skin. He wept for the child he had never known, and for the mother who had been forced to mourn her in silence. When the last note faded into the night, he waited. He saw her gently place the guitar aside and sit by the small headstone, her silhouette a portrait of quiet contemplation against the moonlit sky. He walked up the hill. She heard his footsteps and looked up, her face calm and serene in the pale light. He sat down beside her on the cool earth. They looked out at the rolling sea of silvered prairie grass, a comfortable silence settling between them. "Now I understand," he said, his voice a low whisper. He reached for her hand, his fingers lacing with hers. "All this time, you weren't mourning him. You never were." He turned to look at her, his heart in his eyes. "You were mourning your child. You were wearing black for Ruth." It was as if he had spoken the one, simple truth that had been locked inside her for years. Her serene expression crumbled. A great, shuddering sob escaped her lips. She leaned into him, burying her face in his chest, and began to cry. It was not the silent, choked weeping of her past. It was a storm, a raw, unrestrained torrent of grief that she had held back for 2 long, lonely years. She wept for her daughter, for her lost innocence, for the years of fear and silence. Eli held her, his arms a strong, unshakable circle of safety around her. He held her as she cried, rocking her gently, whispering her name. He was the anchor that allowed her to finally let go, to let the cleansing flood of sorrow wash her clean. They stayed there until the moon was high in the sky and her tears were spent. They walked back down the hill hand in hand, a deep, quiet peace having settled over them both. He opened the door to the cabin. Inside, the oil lamp he had left burning on the table cast a warm, golden glow, pushing back the shadows. It was a beacon of warmth and safety in the vast, dark night. It was a home. Clara stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the soft light. She looked at the simple room, at the hearth, at the table set for 2. She looked at Eli, at his kind, patient face, at the love shining in his eyes, and for the first time since he had known her, a true smile spread across her face. It was not a hesitant quirk of the lips or a fleeting expression of gratitude. It was a smile of pure, unburdened light, a smile that reached her eyes and made them shine with a brilliance that outshone the lamplight. It was the smile of a woman who had walked through the deepest darkness and had, at last, come home. A year passed, a full turn of the seasons across the prairie. The harsh winds of winter gave way to the tender green shoots of spring, which in turn surrendered to the fierce, sun-baked blaze of summer, then softened into the golden melancholy of autumn. With the seasons, the ranch changed, and with the ranch, its inhabitants were transformed. The silence that had once been a shroud of grief became a comfortable quiet, filled not with unspoken pain but with the easy understanding of 2 people who knew each other's souls. The small cabin, Once a prison and a lonely outpost, was now a home, its walls saturated with the scent of baking bread, the sound of soft guitar music, and the low murmur of conversation by the fire. And Clara was changing, too. The haunted, gaunt look in her eyes was gone, replaced by a steady, quiet light. A gentle swell had begun to grow beneath her apron, a new life taking root in the space that sorrow had once occupied. She was pregnant. Eli watched her with a tenderness that was fierce in its protectiveness. He saw the way she would sometimes stop her work and place a hand on her belly, a small, secret smile gracing her lips. He saw a future he had never dared to dream of, a future that was taking shape right before his eyes. The room that had once been her locked sanctuary, her cell, he began to remake. He took the door off its hinges and spent an entire afternoon sanding down the splintered wood of the frame where he had broken the lock. He smoothed it over until not a single rough edge remained, physically erasing the last scar of her old life. He whitewashed the walls, making the small space bright and airy. And in the center of the room, he began to build a cradle. He worked with the same patient care he had shown her, his calloused hands shaping the pine, the scent of fresh-cut wood filling the house with the promise of what was to come. When the next spring arrived, redemption was in a celebratory mood. The winter had been long but not overly harsh, and the promise of a good year was in the air. The town organized a spring festival, a rare gathering for the scattered families of the prairie. Long tables were set up in the main street, laden with roasted pork, cornbread, and apple pies. A fiddler sawed away at a cheerful tune, and the sound of laughter echoed off the false-fronted buildings. Eli and Clara attended, a year ago. The thought of being surrounded by the very people who had whispered about her would have been unimaginable for Clara. But now, she walked beside her husband, her head held high. She carried not just a new life within her, but a new sense of self. As the afternoon sun began to dip toward the horizon, the mayor called for quiet. He announced that Mrs. Clara Hale, Eli's wife, had agreed to share a song with them. A hush fell over the crowd. People turned, their expressions a mixture of surprise and intense curiosity. They remembered the silent, grieving widow. This was someone new. Clara walked to the small wooden platform, her old guitar in her hands. She didn't look nervous, only serene. She sat on the offered stool, took a breath, and began to play. The song was not Ruth's lullaby. It was a melody no one had heard before, a tune that spoke of the harsh, stark beauty of the prairie. The lyrics were simple but powerful. She sang of the wind that could scour a soul, but also carry the seeds of new life. She sang of the resilient wildflowers that bloomed in the rockiest soil. She sang of the endless sky, a canvas for both brutal storms and breathtaking sunrises. It was not a song of sorrow, but a song of survival, a song of hope, born from pain. When she finished, there was a moment of stunned silence. Then, the applause started. Tentative at first, then growing into a warm, genuine wave of appreciation. They had not just heard a song, they had witnessed a resurrection. As Clara stepped down from the platform, a woman she recognized from the general store, one of the ones who used to whisper, approached her. The woman's face was etched with a quiet, weary sadness of its own. She reached out and briefly, hesitantly, took Clara's hand. "That was beautiful," the woman said, her voice low. She wouldn't meet Clara's eyes. "I just wanted to say, you are not the only one who has had to be silent out of fear." She squeezed Clara's hand once, a gesture of profound, unspoken solidarity, and then melted back into the crowd. Clara stood there for a moment, the woman's words echoing in her heart. She understood then that her own quiet suffering had been a mirror for the hidden pains of others. Her voice, now found, could perhaps help others find theirs. On the ride home, she told Eli about the woman. An idea, born from that brief, powerful connection, began to form. Their ranch was remote, a safe haven far from the prying eyes of the town. They started small. Eli cleared out and repaired a small, unused room at the back of the barn. He put a simple cot inside, a clean wash basin, and a sturdy new lock on the door, a lock that could only be bolted from the inside. They let Mr. Abernathy, the lawyer, know that if he ever encountered a woman in a desperate situation, there was a safe place for her to rest for a few days. No questions asked, a place to catch her breath, a relief station. The first woman arrived a month later, dropped off in the dead of night by the lawyer, her face bruised and her eyes hollow with terror. Clara didn't ask for her story. She simply led her to the room, gave her a bowl of warm stew, and told her she was safe. It was all that was needed. The seasons turned again, and the gentle swell of Clara's belly grew into the full, round promise of impending motherhood. The nights grew warm, and the air filled with the chirping of crickets. One evening, Clara sat on the porch in a rocking chair, the one Eli had repaired for her. The full moon bathed the prairie in a soft, ethereal light. She had her guitar in her lap, but she wasn't playing. She was humming a new lullaby, a soft, wordless tune for the child sleeping beneath her heart. She rested her hands on her belly, a picture of profound peace. The cabin door opened, and Eli stepped out. He came and stood behind her, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. He leaned down and pressed a long, tender kiss to her forehead. They stayed like that for a moment, looking out at the vast, starry expanse. The same uncaring stars that had witnessed their bleak wedding journey now seemed to twinkle with a benevolent warmth. "Thank you," Eli whispered into her hair, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for staying." Clara stopped humming and leaned her head back against his chest. She looked up at the endless sky, a soft, genuine smile gracing her lips. "It's because you never asked me why I was silent," she replied, her voice as clear and calm as the moonlight. "You just waited for me to sing." Thank you for listening to our story tonight around the campfire. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so drop a comment below and let's connect. If you enjoyed the tale, please consider subscribing to Wild West Campfire and sharing your thoughts.